Aho, Iaho. Aho, Iaho. Welcome to our channel, Aportes Afro-Costarricenses y Diaspóricos. In this afternoon, I have the wonderful pleasure to have in our conversation this afternoon, Professor Pedro Welch, from retired a professor from the University of the West Indies. And he will be discussing with us and giving us a little more information, especially for those of us in Central America, about reparations. So the title of his discussion this evening will be Tracking the Ethos of Reparation. So welcome, Dr. Welch, and then I am going to give you the opportunity so that you can tell us something about yourself, especially for Central America, Professor Welch, because we really don't know much about what is going on in the Caribbean, and this opportunity is for other scholars in Central America to know about the scholars in especially the English-speaking Caribbean. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Yes, it's my pleasure to be here with you this evening. It's already getting a little dark in Barbados, where I'm from, but I've known Professor Carmen for a number of years, and it is definitely a triple and a quadruple pleasure to be able to sit with her this evening and to share some of the thoughts I have on the question of reparations. It should be informative. I trust that that those in Central America and other parts of the Hispanic Caribbean will become a bit more knowledgeable by the time we are finished about the events that took place in the Caribbean in the period just before emancipation and in the period after emancipation.
Thank you. But before you get in, could you just give us a little snippet of who you are?
Well, I am a fellow Caribbean person. I'm aware that that many of our ancestors had relatives, and they put it very nicely there, had relatives who were shipped from Africa through the Caribbean into Central America and further afield in the Hispanic Caribbean. Several years ago, I wrote a paper on the intra-Caribbean slave trade because it was clear to me that a large number of enslaved people were shipped via Barbados. Barbados became a central shipping point. They were shipped from Africa through Barbados, and then from Barbados, they were shipped across the Caribbean, places like Colombia. You find them going also to Brazil, and you also find some enslaved people being shipped to places like Costa Rica and other areas of the Caribbean. And I've been working on the whole question of enslavement in the Caribbean for several years. One of my books, which was published in 2003 by Ian Randall Publishers, is called Slave Society in the City. And in that book, I looked at the urban context of the slave plantation system. It was a pioneering work, which has received several citations on Google Scholar and other areas. In addition to that, I had another interest, which was the whole question of the history of medicine. I'm currently working on 1,000 pages of reports from medical doctors who served in the British Caribbean and who were treating yellow fever. And that I hope will come out sometime in the middle of next year. But I've also published on the question of mental illness and how our ancestors were treated in the mental asylums. So I've done a lot of that. I retired from the University of Este after 34 years of working there. I retired as deputy principal of the Cayfield campus. My principal was Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, who's well known across the historiographic world. But I became deputy principal and I retired at that level. but I continue to do research. I've also worked as a counselor, yes, which is to say that I've worked with several overseas publishing houses and media houses. The BBC, for example, I've done work for the BBC. I was asked to look at the genealogical background of an actress called Gwyneth Paltrow, and I work in that in a film called, I think, Who Do You Think You Are? and I was the historian who researched her background, and that was NBC. So the BBC and NBC, and that's what I've been doing. I mean, there are a lot of other things, but I wouldn't want to bore your audience with a whole lot of things that I've been doing. I do speak a little Spanish, yo hablo poquito, but through lack of practice, I'm not as fluent as I used to be. But I've been to Cuba, I've been to the Dominican Republic, I've been to Puerto Rico, and Venezuela, and other places through the Caribbean. And I usually can understand Spanish quite well. But this evening, I will certainly not be speaking in Spanish. This evening, I'll be speaking only in English, no?
Okay.
Okay, bueno. Yes. It is my intention to begin our discussion, our presentation, firstly by going back into the past and looking at the origin of the slave system in the Anglophone Caribbean. And I'll be using that background to provide a basis for answering the question of why do we need reparations? So we're going to begin at the very beginning. In the early 17th century, the English arrived in the Caribbean. They landed in such islands as San Cristobal or St. Kitts. They also went to Antigua, Barbados, and other islands. Later, they ended up in Jamaica, but that's a little later. And then much later again, they ended up in Trinidad, the island of Trinidad and Tobago. But there are several islands of the Caribbean: Grenada, Dominica, St. Lucia, etc. When they arrived in Barbados, and I'm using Barbados as my starting off point here, is within the span of a few years of their arrival, they began to import enslaved people from Africa. I want to note that I'm using the word enslaved because in today's historians generally tend to prefer the word enslaved rather than the word slave. Sometimes we cannot avoid using the word slave, but generally speaking, I more often speak of the enslaved man or the enslaved woman, and I speak of people that we used to call slave owners. I speak of them as enslavers. So here we have it. The enslaved people from Africa were brought to Barbados. The English arrived around the 1620s, and by 1640, the population it had a majority of Africans in it, because the sugar industry begins around that time, 1640s, 1630s. 1640s, what happened was what some historians call a sugar revolution. Yes, and what happened was that the African population begins to double and triple, and by the 1650s, the whites are in a minority in Barbados. But what happens is that in order to enslave Blacks, there has to be at least a philosophical acceptance or understanding that it was legitimate, it was legal to do so. There's a very famous Caribbean historian, she has passed now, but the late Elsa Gavaya, who wrote a book called The West Indian Slave Laws. And she made the point that before you could have any large scale enslavement, you had to have the opinion that person could be made slaves or enslaved, and that they could be held as enslaved. And she goes on to say, without this philosophical acceptance, the legal structure that emerged would have been impossible. That is not to say that that the slave laws that developed in the Caribbean did not have their antecedents in Europe, because long before the English arrived, and the Spanish and the French, countries in Europe had systems of bond servitude. For example, we have whites in England, servants who were indentured or contracted to landlords. And their treatment was almost like that of enslaved people. So there were laws in Britain before the English arrived in the Caribbean, and laws in Spain and in France before they arrived in the Caribbean, which resemble to some extent the laws that would later come to govern the enslaved people. In the Spanish Caribbean, as you know, and or anybody in Costa Rica will know, you have the siete partidas, the Spanish slave laws. In the case of the French, you have the Code Noir. But in the case of the British, the law that, the first slave law that we know of, which is spread from Barbados to Jamaica, it is spread from Barbados to the Carolinas in North America. The first slave law is passed in 1661. And this first slave law begins with certain assumptions. In the preamble to that 1661 slave law, and I have a note here to myself, it makes it clear that the enslaved people are an uncertain, devilish kind of people. Now, it is particularly important for us to recognize that what is happening here is that they're defining the enslaved people as a kind of other, un otro, una otra, another. They are human, but not quite human. They're human beings, but they are different. So they're defined in the law as I said, as persons who are devilish and who are not fit, it is said, to be governed by English law. In other words, they can be enslaved because they're different. More than that, there is the notion that they're also heathen. That's another term that's used to describe Africans. That misses the point that long before the Europeans arrived in Africa, several African groups also had a monotheistic religion. For example, the Akan of Ghana, who are known in the English Caribbean later as the Coromantee. Some of them are also called the Ashanti or the Asante. Those are names that are variously applied to them. These people worship one God. And not only did they worship one God, they had one day of worship for him. And that day was the seventh day of the weekly cycle. And the God that they worship was called Kwame. Just as you have in Europe, you have Jehovah, and the Christians can refer to the God Almighty as Jehovah or Yahweh. In Africa, you had monotheistic religion before Europeans arrived. And so for Europeans to say that Africans were heathenish is certainly not truthful. It is really not anything that can be demonstrated. I mean, it is true that Africans in some parts of Africa had different religions that did not exist in Europe, but that's not to say they were heathenish. So the law said that. Later on, in 1688, the law is repeated, and this is what it says here. I'm going to quote from the law of 1688. It says, Africans were of, quote, a barbarous and wild and savage nature, such as renders them wholly unqualified to be governed by the laws, customs, and practices of our nation. In other words, what they're saying is that, again, these are other. These are not like us. So you have a legal framework that treats or begins to treat our people not as people, but as a species of property. So what emerges in the English-speaking Caribbean, the Anglophone Caribbean, is a system that makes our people into chattel, a species of property. They're human beings, but they're like cows and horses and houses. They are seen as property, chattel. I don't know if it's a Spanish equivalent of the word chattel, but in English, we speak about chattel enslavement, chattel slavery, C-H-A-T-T-E-L. The word chattel itself comes from an old Anglo-Saxon word, which really was akin or similar to the word cattle. Cattle, so that it is derived from the same root, linguistic root. So here you have the English, defining the enslaved people from Africa as chattel, almost like cattle, species of property. So, and this governs the system. To make it worse, the law separates the enslaved people from others who they call Christian. So the white indentured servants who were brought out as laborers as well, and the whites who owned the plantations were considered to be Christian. So on the one side, you have Christian, white, and other. That's the Africans, the blacks. Now, one of the things that we will note as well is that the law establishes a framework for dealing with these enslaved people. If a black man fought against or happened to strike a Christian, quote unquote Christian, by that we mean a white person, the punishment could end with death. It could also include disfigurement. You could cut off a person's nose, their ears, a hand, a foot. So the laws were very clear. But if that is what the law says, the reality is even worse. Because I'm talking first about law. And I have an example of what happened on the ground. In 1764, there's an enslaved man called Sharper. He's accused of rape. The fact is that there's no court system in which a black enslaved person has representation. So the fact is that this man Sharper, we have no way of knowing what redress, what mitigation was available to him under the law, other than the fact the law was very clear. He was another kind of human being. So he is brought before the authorities and he is sentenced to death. The governor of Barbados, his private secretary, wrote a letter in which he said that he was commanded by the governor to begin proceedings of execution against Sharper. And I'm reading some of it here as it is in my notes. This is what the secretary says. I am commanded by His Excellency the Governor to acquaint you that he entirely approves of the proceedings of the judgment against the Negro man Sharper. It is his pleasure, that is the governor's pleasure, that on Monday, the 13th of August, the said Negro is to be carried to the old churchyard in Bridgetown. Bridgetown is the capital of Barbados, to be tied to a stake, to be fixed for the purpose, and that his privy members were to be cut off and burned before his eyes. Now, when we say his privy members, I don't know if my Hispanic audience will fully understand, but privy members, we're talking about his penis and his testicles. They were to be cut off before his eyes and burnt before his eyes. And it goes on, and the governor's private secretary's report goes on to say that the whole execution may be performed with such solemnity that it may strike the spectator with the greatest awe and terror. In short, what he was saying, they were going to assemble all the enslaved who were living in British and around to witness what was happening. This was going to be an execution that was to send a message to the enslaved people. If you try to resist, this is what will happen to you. Well, what happened, I have argued elsewhere that this is the first example of terrorism that we can find anywhere in the New World, because the governor's private secretary says that it may strike the spectator with the greatest awe and terror. That's where it begins. It doesn't begin with people fighting for justice. It begins with people who are seeking to deny justice. That's where the terror begins. I've often told my students that Sharper died before he died. He died. In Espanol, Sharper murió antes de morir. He died before he died. Meaning that you remove his manhood, you destroyed his sense of himself. That's what you're doing. Well, if that was bad enough, in Jamaica, there's a planter called Thomas Thistlewood. Thomas Thistlewood had some enslaved people who tried to resist by running away. What we call in English marronage. They practice marronage. They ran away, and in order to prevent them from running away, if any were captured, he would tie them down to a stake, an iron stake, and use a piece of wood or a piece of metal to force open their mouths. And then he would get an enslaved man called Derby to defecate in their mouths. I don't know if what your audience will, if you want to like the words there, but to use a colloquial word, he would get an enslaved person to shit in their mouths. And then they would tie a gag around their mouths to prevent them from spitting out the feces. I'm sharing this because we have to understand later when we ask the question about reparations, why it is that we require reparations. And then there's a woman called Mary Prince, who wrote her account of what she went through. And her account talks of frequent beatings and maltreatment. And then we have an enslaved man called Equiano. Equiano sails from Africa to the Caribbean, and he spends some time in Caribbean waters on slave ships in the Caribbean itself. And I want to share something that he says about his experience on a slave ship, because he was enslaved in Africa, brought to the Caribbean, and he was enslaved on a slave ship, working on a slave ship. And this is what he says. He says it was almost a constant practice for the white employees on the slave ship to commit violent depredations on the chastity of the female slaves. He says, when we have had some of these enslaved people on board of my master's vessels, because he's writing from a perspective of an enslaved person on one of these ships. He says, I have known these men to commit these acts. I have known them gratify their brutal passion with females not 10 years old. And these abominations, he says, some of them practice such a scandalous excess. This is Equiano. This is the first person account of what happened So we have all of these examples to tell us that enslavement was one of the worst experiences that anyone could ever consider, could ever think of at that time. So we know what the punishment was for resisting, but our enslaved ancestors resisted. We know that already that some of them ran away, they committed marriage. Some of the cooks were spit into the saucepans and while they were cooking for the enslavers. We know that they would poke fun at the enslavers in song and in dance and in satire. We know that. But the important thing is that they longed to be free. That's basically it. Well, some of them managed to get their freedom, so that in Jamaica, we have a group of enslaved people called the Maroons, who live in the mountainous areas of Jamaica, and they establish themselves and they reconstitute their African existence in Jamaica. That's in Jamaica. We also have a similar group in Suriname, who are known as the Bush Negroes. Now, the word Negro is a very pejorative term. We don't use it, but that's the term that was used then. And the Bush Negroes also established communities in the interior, in Suriname, and also in the area that later became known as British Guyana. So we have communities of Africans. But by and large, the vast majority of enslaved people remain enslaved on the plantations. The mortality rate was extremely high. In some countries, as for example in Haiti, Saint-Domingue, the mortality rate was so high that an enslaved person might live at most about 10 years from the time they're shipped until until later. They live about 10 years. So they were replaced rapidly. In fact, one of the reasons for the Haitian Revolution is that a large proportion of the enslaved people were of African birth and had grown up in Africa and therefore had not yet been socialized into an enslaved society. And they still therefore held what we may call philosophies of freedom. And many of them kept the African religion and the African sensibility. So that we have, but the reason why you have that occurring in Haiti is because, I said, so many were dying that you were constantly refreshing the African component. It is true elsewhere as well in the Caribbean. We know that in Hispanic Caribbean, that you also have similar conditions. Or in the Hispanic Caribbean, our African forefathers are also treated badly. Very, very, very cruelly. I expect that there will be similar stories in Costa Rica. There will be stories like that in Colombia.
Somos voces de la historia, sangre, tinta y papel. Somos voces de la historia, mis ancestros, su saber, mis ancestros, su saber, mis ancestros, su saber.